Under the silvery glow of a cold moon, a quiet suburban home became the backdrop for an unexpected and chilling turn of events. What seemed like an ordinary evening spiraled into a gripping tale of confusion, fear, and redemption, revealing how even in the deepest shadows, the potential for hope and healing can emerge. This is the story of a family irrevocably altered and a community confronted with difficult truths. Welcome to our channel, where stories come alive with emotion and meaning. Here, we craft tales that touch hearts, inspire change, and remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. If you enjoy stories like these, consider subscribing, engaging, sharing, and also like the video. Sit back and watch this heart-touching narrative. The cold moonlight spilled through the sheer curtains of the McCarter home, casting long, spectral shadows on the walls. Tasha McCarter sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes heavy from another grueling shift at the diner. She had barely laid her head on the pillow when she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside. Assuming it was just her daughter stirring, she brushed it off. In the next room, 12-year-old Aaliyah was clutching her blankets, her breathing shallow and quick. Her night terrors had become more vivid lately, a sinister combination of shadowy figures and whispered voices that she couldn't shake even when awake. Tonight, though, something felt different. The noise beyond her door wasn't her imagination. It was real. Unaware of the distress inside, Officer Ray Adams stepped cautiously into the house. The call had been vague, sounds of breaking glass, possible movement inside, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet the air felt charged, heavy with something he couldn't quite name. The locked doors and sealed windows struck him as unusual, especially for such an unassuming home. His flashlight beam traced the edges of family photos on the walls and the faint marks of a child's crayon on the hallway baseboards. "Police," he called out, his voice low but firm. No answer. Aaliyah stiffened at the sound, her imagination racing. She had overheard enough stories about break-ins and bad people to fear the worst. Her mother always reassured her that their locks would keep them safe, but tonight, her heart raced with the belief that someone had found a way in. She tiptoed to her bedroom door, pressing her ear against the wood. In her room, Tasha stirred at the muffled voice. Her heart leaped as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The operator confirmed what she already feared. An officer had been dispatched to her address. Confusion washed over her. She hadn't called the police. Could Aaliyah have managed to find her phone during one of her episodes? Ray moved further down the hallway, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. Something felt off, but he couldn't place it. He paused outside a door that was bolted shut from the outside, a jarring sight. His brow furrowed as he tried the handle. Locked. Inside, Aaliyah's breaths came faster. The rattling of the doorknob felt like thunder in her ears. Panic surged through her, and in her desperation, she grabbed a lamp from her nightstand. If the intruder got in, she'd be ready. She didn't want to, but she would fight. She had to. Tasha rushed into the hallway just as Ray began to call out again. "Ma'am, this is Officer Adams with the police department. Is everything okay?" The sound of his voice stopped her cold, but not before Aaliyah screamed from behind her door, the sheer terror spilling over. The scream made Ray flinch, his instincts screaming danger. Before Tasha could explain, the officer braced himself to act. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Would Aaliyah's fear lead to a tragic misunderstanding? Would Tasha reach them in time to explain? In the quiet suburban home, the night stretched, heavy with uncertainty and fear, as the boundaries between safety and danger blurred. The hallway stretched ahead of Officer Ray Adams, dim and oppressive. Each step seemed heavier than the last as he moved cautiously through the McCarter home, his flashlight casting elongated shadows on the walls. He had checked the kitchen and living room. Nothing out of place, but something about the silence pressed against him, feeding his unease. The strange rope tied around one door handle stopped him in his tracks. "What the hell?" he muttered, narrowing his eyes. It didn't make sense. He had seen ropes used for restraint in other cases, situations that haunted him long after the reports were filed. His stomach tightened at the thought of what might be behind the door. Ray hesitated for a moment, considering his options. His instincts nagged at him to think it through, but the urgency of the situation pushed him forward. Carefully, he untied the rope and twisted the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room cloaked in darkness. Inside, 12-year-old Alia McCarter stood frozen by her dresser, her small figure illuminated by the beam of Ray's flashlight. She was shaking, her face pale and glistening with tears. Clutched in her trembling hands was a toy gun, sleek, black, and eerily realistic in the dim light. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto the figure in her doorway. Ray's pulse spiked, adrenaline surging through his veins. His brain screamed threat, trained to respond to moments like this, where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. The shape of the object in Alia's hands was unmistakable in his panicked mind. He didn't have time to rationalize, didn't have the luxury of parsing the details in the dim, chaotic moment. "Drop the weapon," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. But Alia didn't process his words. In her disoriented state, still caught in the lingering grip of her night terrors, she could barely comprehend what was happening. The figure before her seemed monstrous, not someone who could help. Her grip tightened on the toy gun, and she instinctively raised it, her arms trembling as she pointed it toward the stranger in her room. Time slowed. The faint squeak of the dresser behind her, the quickening beat of Ray's heart, the tremor in her voice as she whimpered. It all faded into a singular, gut-wrenching moment of action. Ray's training kicked in. His mind screamed one thing: threat. In a single practiced motion, he drew his weapon and fired. The sound was deafening, a roar that swallowed the small room. Alia's figure crumpled to the floor, the toy gun slipping from her hands and clattering onto the hardwood. For a moment, silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps pounding down the hall as Tasha burst into the room. She froze at the sight of her daughter on the ground. Officer Adams standing rigid, his weapon still drawn, his face pale with shock. "No, Alia." Tasha's scream pierced the quiet, shattering the fragile calm. Ray's mind reeled as his flashlight caught the plastic sheen of the toy gun on the floor. The reality of what he had done crashed into him, a tidal wave of horror and regret. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't a weapon. It was a child. "I didn't." Ray's voice faltered as Tasha fell to her knees, pulling Alia into her arms. The girl's eyes fluttered open weakly, a faint whimper escaping her lips. The bullet had grazed her side, sparing her life, but leaving behind a shallow bleeding wound. Relief mixed with anguish as Tasha clutched her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. Ray staggered backward, his hands trembling, his weapon falling to the ground. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of his mistake crushing him from every angle. The hospital room was sterile and quiet, save for the faint beep of monitors. Alia lay in the bed, her small frame nearly swallowed by the crisp white sheets. A bandage wrapped around her side bore silent testimony to the events of the night before. Tasha sat at her daughter's bedside, her hand gently stroking Alia's hair. Her face was drawn, exhaustion and anguish etched into every line. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, as she replayed the horrific moment over and over. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was subdued, almost apologetic, but Tasha's heart still leaped in her chest. She didn't want to see anyone, not the doctors, not the police, and certainly not Officer Ray Adams. She couldn't bear the sight of the man who had nearly taken her daughter's life. Outside the room, Ray stood, his uniform traded for civilian clothes. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The image of Alia crumpling to the floor, the toy gun slipping from her hand, haunted him. He had barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with her mother's anguished screams. He didn't enter. He couldn't. Instead, he turned away, walking down the corridor, his mind racing with guilt and regret. The media frenzy erupted the next morning. The headlines were brutal. Child shot in suburban home by police officer. News channels played grainy footage of the McCarter home, zooming in on the rope-secured door as if it were a centerpiece of a crime scene. Analysts debated the use of force, parsing every second of the incident with the benefit of hindsight. The community was in turmoil. Vigils were held outside the hospital, candles flickering in the cold wind as neighbors gathered, holding signs and murmuring prayers for Aaliyah's recovery. Some were outraged, demanding justice and accountability. Others defended the officer, citing the split-second decisions law enforcement must make. The once quiet suburban neighborhood became a stage for protests, arguments, and grief. For Tasha, none of it mattered. All she cared about was her daughter. She ignored the reporters who camped outside the hospital, their questions invasive and cruel. Why was her door tied shut? Did you know the officer? Do you blame him? She didn't have answers, only pain. The investigation progressed slowly. Officer Adams had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome. His colleagues were divided, some expressing quiet support, others struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the devastating mistake he had made. Ray himself stayed away from the precinct. He spent his days combing over the details of the incident, replaying every moment, and wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Then came the twist. It began with a casual mention in the investigative team's report, a detail Ray had overlooked in the chaos. Aaliyah McCarter, they noted, was the daughter of Michael McCarter, a former officer in the same department. Ray froze when he read the name. His mind spun, digging through memories long buried. Michael McCarter, the rookie with the bright smile and endless determination. The man who had been killed in the line of duty nearly a decade earlier during a dangerous hostage situation. Ray had been there that day, one of the officers who carried Michael's body out of the building. The grief had been overwhelming, the department shattered by the loss of one of their own. And now Ray realized the little girl he had shot was Michael's daughter. The weight of the revelation crushed him. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was a sense of betrayal, of having failed not only Aaliyah, but the memory of a man he had respected deeply. How had he not made the connection sooner? The thought consumed him as he sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the photograph he had dug out of an old box. Michael in his academy uniform, beaming with pride. The news spread quickly, deepening the fissures in the community. Some saw the connection as a tragic irony, others as a damning indictment of the system. Ray's colleagues were stunned into silence. For Tasha, the revelation brought a new wave of emotions: pain, anger, and a haunting sense of déjà vu. The police had taken her husband, and now they had almost taken her daughter. 1 week after the shooting, Ray finally gathered the courage to visit the hospital. He didn't go to Aaliyah's room, but instead found Tasha sitting alone in the waiting room. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know," Ray began, his voice raw. "I didn't know she was Michael's daughter. I didn't know." Tasha's gaze hardened. "And if you had, would it have made a difference?" The question hit him like a blow. He didn't have an answer. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything." For a moment, Tasha said nothing. Then she stood, her eyes locking with his. "Sorry won't fix what you've done. But maybe, just maybe, you'll understand now why this hurts so much." As she walked away, Ray was left standing alone, the weight of her words and his actions heavier than ever. The fallout of that cold, moonlit night would follow him forever, and in the quiet moments he would think of Michael and Aaliyah, and the lives forever changed by his mistake. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Officer Ray Adams entered its final days. Months of anguish had led to this moment. Tasha McCarter sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were focused on the polished wood of the witness stand, but her mind was elsewhere, back in that moonlit hallway, back to the sound of the gunshot that had nearly taken her daughter's life. Aaliyah was recovering, though her physical wounds were healing faster than the emotional ones. Across the room, Ray Adams sat slouched at the defendant's table, a shadow of his former self. His once proud shoulders now sagged, and his eyes carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. He had pleaded not guilty to charges of reckless endangerment and excessive use of force, not out of defiance but as a formality. In truth, he wanted to take full responsibility for what he had done. The mistake had cost him his identity, his career, and his faith in himself. The trial was gripping. Lawyers debated policies, training procedures, and the nuances of split-second decisions. Witnesses testified, and experts weighed in, but nothing could erase the simple, horrifying truth. A child had nearly died at the hands of someone sworn to protect her. When it was Tasha's turn to address the court, the room fell silent. She rose slowly, every eye turning to her. Standing tall, she took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. Her voice was clear, but her words carried a tremor of emotion. "I've spent months grappling with what happened that night," she began. "I've asked myself over and over how things could have been different, why my daughter's life was almost taken, why my family has been put through so much pain." She paused, her gaze shifting to Ray. His head was bowed, unable to meet her eyes. "But through it all," she continued, "I've also thought about what justice truly means. It's not just about punishment. It's about ensuring that no other family has to endure what we've endured. It's about creating a future where all people can feel safe, regardless of their skin color or their circumstances." The courtroom was riveted. Tasha's voice grew stronger. "I don't forgive easily, and I don't excuse what happened. But I know holding on to hate won't bring my daughter peace. It won't bring my husband peace, and it won't help our community heal." She turned toward Ray, her voice softening. "I hope you use what's left of your life to make sure this never happens again. I hope you fight for change as hard as I fight for my daughter." Ray's shoulders trembled as he lifted his head. Tears streaked his face as he stood to address the court. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, his voice cracking. "But I promise to spend the rest of my life working to prevent tragedies like this. I'm stepping down from the force, and I'll dedicate my life to speaking out, to making sure others don't make the mistakes I made." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The trial concluded with Ray's resignation and a suspended sentence. While some felt it wasn't enough, many, including Tasha, saw it as a step toward something greater. Months later, Tasha stood at Olia's grave, the morning sun warming her face. She held a photograph of her daughter, smiling and full of life, and whispered a promise. "I'll never stop fighting for you, Olia. I'll honor your memory by making the world safer for every child, for every family. You deserve better, and I'll make sure others get it." In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of children laughing in the park. It was a sound of hope. And in that moment, Tasha allowed herself to believe in the possibility of healing, not just for her, but for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Your presence means the world to us, and we hope this story resonated with you. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, share, like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.